You know, economics as a discipline did not exist separately until 100 years ago. What existed was moral philosophy. Those who wrote on economics studied philosophy and they studied history. Even Keynes, who started his career as an economist in the 20th century, early 20th century, did mathematics. He never had a formal training in anything called economics. He studied mathematics and he studied philosophy. Now, unfortunately, both history and philosophy have dropped out, philosophy completely, from what today economics students are supposed to learn. And that is a great pity, because a part of philosophy is logic. And logic is not simply mathematics. Mathematics is only formal logic. Okay? There is a very large area of logic which is called non-formal logic. And this includes, for example, when I talk about fallacies, the fallacies can arise from three different causes. One is material fallacies, which arise from incorrect statement of fact. So what I was describing to you as Ricardo's fallacy starts as a material fallacy, an incorrect statement that both countries produce both goods, or by extension, he believed all countries could produce all goods. That's a wrong statement of fact, and it is termed a material fallacy by logicians. Then you can have verbal fallacies, okay, which is the incorrect use of terms. In fact, Ricardo compounds his material fallacy also in his theory with a verbal fallacy. He says, and I don't have the quote here, but it is there in my article, that if Britain could grow wine more cheaply than Portugal, then it would be to Britain's benefit to grow wine rather than. Now, there is no such thing as growing wine. You grow the raw material and then you process it into wine. So what is Ricardo doing here? He is actually collapsing together two different processes and using this strange term, grow wine, which is a verbal fallacy. Okay? Because he's drawing your attention away from the fact that Britain could not produce the raw material for wine, that is grapes. All right? Now, similarly, eventually I said that this results in a converse fallacy of accident in Ricardo's theory of international trade. Starting with a very specific assumption and saying all countries benefit from specialization, whereas in fact what you always had in history and you have to this day is a one-sided demand on the global south by the industrializing global north, which is very important to keep in mind. We don't really need them as much as they need us. The standard of living of the populations of the United States, of Germany, Britain, etc., of the cold temperate countries would drop very sharply to the levels of late medieval times if they could not import from the commodities that they consume daily from the global south. All right? Now, since you are used to being told that your countries are backward, they're poor, they're non-industrialized, they follow wrong theories, this might come as a surprise to you. But all this telling you to hate yourselves is part of the ideological effort to obscure real relationships in terms of global trade. Now, similarly, when we come to phenomena which have been occurring inside our country, we find that even very well-known leading economists are prone to put forward completely logically incorrect, fallacious ideas. I will mention a couple of them here and put it in the context of what I was discussing last time. That is how the Nehruvian dirigist policies for 40 years were sensible in terms of protecting the economy from the destabilizing international division of labor, which had led to a very sharp fall in the grain availability and the nutritional standard of the mass of our population. I always say mass because, of course, the minority which had property and which was well-to-do never suffered, even under colonialism. So let us be very clear that the propertied classes colluded with the colonial masters, and they were treated very well by the colonial masters. Laws were passed, laws of contract, which were new to pre-colonial India, under which if a laborer or a tenant defaulted in rent payment or did not pay back money in time that he had been forced to borrow from the employer, could be taken to court. This never existed in pre-colonial India. So the entire system of laws was also framed in colonial India, and we have the legacy of those laws continuing to this day, which was heavily tilted in favor of a minority of the propertied classes and basically tilted against the majority of the population who comprised the laboring poor, whether peasants, artisans, or laborers. And that really is something which continues to a very large extent to this day. The courts, it's very difficult for a poor person to get justice through courts. We have to run around, for years and years before the case is even heard. And after that, it cannot be sure, really, of getting good judgment. Now, I pointed out that an essential result of colonial exploitation, because of the one-sided nature of the demand that the global north had on our agriculture, was a sharp decline in the per capita food grain availability. And as the lady introducing the subject pointed out, this has been a major focus of my own research because nobody else was talking about it. And I also pointed out to you last time that over the 40 years of dirigism, we succeeded very slowly in raising our grain availability from 137 kilograms per capita in 1946 to 184 kilograms per capita by 1993. Of course, neoliberal policies start 2 years earlier, but all the data are really from 2 years later. That is why we are saying 1993 rather than 1991. Then what happens? I pointed out to you last time, giving a very quick summary of what I said, overview, so that you remember what exactly we were discussing, that every single policy which was designed to protect the small producers in particular was removed. They were designed to protect during those 40 years the peasants, artisans, small-scale textile producers, handloom producers, the mill sector, etc. I mentioned that a certain part of the total output of textiles was reserved for the small-scale sector. That reservation has gone now. So every form of petty production was sought to be protected and encouraged. And I said that it is a very wrong idea to say that there was as the people who attack these policies are constantly attacking Nehruvian policies now for their own interest. It's a very wrong idea to say there was a heavy industry bias, the small producers were neglected, or the Green Revolution was very bad. This is all part of the ideological attack. And what is the aim of neoliberal policies? What is the basic characteristic? I pointed out last time itself that it had two pillars, which are very similar, practically identical with colonial policies. The first pillar is restricting the purchasing power of the mass of the population through fiscal contraction, which was legalized through the passage of the FRBM Act in 2004. That is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which was in fact tabled earlier, but which was actually passed into law by the UPA government, which took power in 2004, unfortunately. Because the whole paradox was that even though the political formation which took power in 2004 was supposed to be a progressive political formation, because after all, it was led by the same party that Nehru belonged to, the Congress party, supported by the left. But in the meantime, the crucial ministries, the Commerce Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the people manning those crucial ministries, and the Planning Commission, the chairman of the Planning Commission, were all individuals who had been converted. Either they were already or they were converted to neoliberal theology. I call it theology because there is no logical basis for the economic policies of neoliberalism. So they had all been converted to neoliberal theology. Some may have actually believed in that theology. For example, the finance minister then in 1991 had learned Keynesian economics. He was from Oxbridge. But on the other hand, Prabhat's argument is, of course, that he didn't really believe in what he was doing, but he thought it was unavoidable. There was no alternative because the entire world political and economic scenario had changed. There was an upsurge of supply-side economics and neoliberal policies in the West, which India could not resist. Now, I think that is completely wrong. India was a sovereign, independent power. It had every possibility of resisting these very iniquitous and world trends. Okay, but anyway, let that be. So, so this is a paradox that Nehru's own party was actually split into two in terms of ideology. There was a progressive wing which did not like neoliberal policies and which actually opposed in some ways. But the dominant decision-making powers had shifted to ministers who went by whatever the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund said. And that included the then finance minister, who became prime minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. But it did not include, for example, people like Sonia Gandhi, because she set up this National Advisory Council at which various representatives of the non-government organizations like my friend Aruna Roy was invited. And they put forward a completely different idea that we have to have a National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And of course, at that time, in that first UPA government, the left had a very large presence, I think 40 seats at least. How many? Okay, 60. 62. So that was a very large component of total parliamentary seats. It had a very strong voice at that time. And without the support of the left, of course, these progressive acts like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act could not have been passed. In fact, people, progressive economists abroad, were surprised. He said, the world over, you know, there are policies being followed which are reducing employment. So how is it that in India you managed to pass this kind of an act? And that is because from the beginning, the neoliberal policies have been contested. They have never been accepted in full by the whole of the intelligentsia or even by the whole of the political class. Though I regret to say that everyone was strongly influenced by these neoliberal policies, ultimately. Because after all the media, your print media, your television, everything is, as it were, pushing neoliberal policies constantly at you all the time. So even those who are committed to a very different political trajectory, many of them many of their ideas have been influenced by this, as tends to happen in any kind of reality. So I talked about the inverse relationship in the colonial period, which had been reversed. That is, between exports, the inverse relation between exports and domestic food availability, which had been reversed for 40 years. So we had climbed back slowly. But then I said that within the next 10 to 15 years, the whole gains of these 40 years was completely lost. In fact, if we take the 3 years centered on the year 2001, which was actually a bad drought year also, per capita grain availability had fallen to 165 kilograms from the 184 kilograms that I had mentioned in the early 90s, at the beginning of the reforms. So from 93 to just 10 years, actually, just a decade, not even 15 years, it had fallen by almost 20 kilograms per capita. And you can easily calculate the calorie decline. And this is the average. Now, yours or mine, availability did not fall. So for the 70 to 80% of the population, the fall was much more. Their energy intake and protein intake fell much more. Now, 1 kilogram of grain gives you 3,450 kilocalories of energy. All right? Just write it down. It's a very easy calculation. So if you have a per capita fall in the year of 20 kilograms per capita, then it will be 20 times 3,450 calories divided by, on a daily basis, 365. You can easily calculate the daily decline on average. And you can do it for every year, And this is something that economics students should be aware of. The table of nutritional equivalent of foods is given in every National Sample Survey report for the last 70 years. They have published nutritional intake in India, report on nutritional intake. And the table of how you convert physical quantities of different foods to their calorie, protein, and fat equivalents is there in every single report. So it's very easy to calculate. You don't need me to do the calculation. You can do the calculation yourself. All right. Now, but the problem was not to end by the beginning of this century. Things got even worse because there was a completely incorrect and fallacious interpretation of what was happening. Stocks were building up in the public distribution system. At the same time that our output and grain availability was falling, very large stocks were building up. So by 2002-03 or so, something like 46 to 50 million tons of extra food grain stocks were there with the Food Corporation of India, and they didn't know what to do with it. Now, how do you interpret the build-up of stocks? Under what circumstances do stocks build up? Our official economists gave a completely wrong argument. They said stocks have built up. By definition, if stocks build up, then and you're not able to sell it through the get rid of those stocks through the public distribution system, it means that supply is more than demand, or another way of saying it is demand is less than supply. Now, they said stocks have built up because the minimum support prices to farmers have been too high. So they have been producing more than the market requires. So they gave an argument of overproduction. But overproduction is impossible because the per capita output has been falling. And it has been falling from levels which have not yet reached even the 1900 level. So how can you say there is overproduction? And yet every government official said that. And very unfortunately, when Professor Amartya Sen, he visits India every winter, he used to at that time also. He also in a public lecture around December, January of around, I think 2002 or 2003, he said that, large stocks, food grain stocks are a cause for concern. And the reason is, he repeated what the government officials had said, that MSP has been too high. Now, this was a disastrous misinterpretation of events. In fact, I can give you 4 different scenarios. When stocks build up, by definition, domestic supply, that is production adjusted for net imports, is more than domestic demand, okay? That's why you have stocks building up. But there can be very different scenarios giving this result, and they call for very different policy measures. There are 4 possible scenarios. Only one of these stocks build up would not be a cause for concern. That is when supply per capita is increasing and demand per capita is increasing but not increasing as fast. Then you will have stocks build up. Supply is increasing but faster than demand is increasing. In any case, when supply is increasing at the same rate as demand is increasing, there will be no change in stocks. So these 2 scenarios are okay. The other 2 scenarios are a cause for concern. First, when supply per capita is constant, you're not getting any increase in supply per capita, but demand per capita is falling. That is a cause for concern. Why should demand per capita be falling? And the last scenario is the worst scenario, when supply per capita is falling, but demand per capita is falling even faster. So you get a stocks build-up, all right? If your demand per capita is falling even faster. Now, it was the last and worst scenario which had been happening. And why was demand per capita falling? Because of the employment and income deflating contractionary fiscal policies, which had been followed from 1991 onwards by every government, regardless of its political complexion. In fact, you had a kind of cycle. When a government came into office, immediately, because it had 5 years of office in front of it, immediately for 2 years, it would cut back on public expenditure. There would be a sharp cut in the fiscal deficit. Then, third year, nothing much happens. The last 2 years, when they're about to face general elections, and people are very annoyed because the unemployment rate has been going up, they're getting poorer, the food availability is going down. So in order to counter that, they start a little bit of expansionary policies in the 2 years, in the run-up to. I find this cycle again and again and again. I meant to write a paper on it, but I just haven't had time. Throughout the neoliberal period, you find this cycle, which I call a political cycle. But on the whole, over the entire period, you have an overall income deflating contractionary fiscal policy being followed, which was in very sharp contrast to the 40 years of expansionary fiscal policies which were being followed. And the neoliberal fiscal contraction is very similar to the colonial period attempts of the British always to keep domestic consumption in check. Of course, they did it by extremely harsh and extreme means, by spending only 2/3 or so, or even less of the entire revenues they collected within the country. The rest was not spent at all within the country. On the contrary, it was paid out as so-called payment to the export crops producers. In other words, they were taxed out of their goods without being paid even the rupee equivalent of their exports. Now, the second pillar of neoliberal policy is again very similar to colonial policy, and that is free trade, which I mentioned last time. That is, after many countries, including India, signed the agreement on agriculture. It first started as a Dunkel draft. It was debated. Finally, you had the agreement on agriculture, which India signed in 1994. Then the earlier GATT was dissolved and the World Trade Organization was set up. Okay? Many countries signed and India signed because they were told that, look, in the WTO, you will not have to negotiate with every single country separately on trade matters, because it will all come through and be adjudicated through the World Trade Organization, which was an attractive proposition. But that actually did not happen. Even after signing GATT, within 3 years, the advanced countries, the industrially advanced countries, the United States, the Western European countries, the group of 7 basically, started putting pressure on the Indian government by 1997, saying that you don't have a balance of payments problem now. You have to get rid of your quantitative restrictions much earlier. You can't hang on to quantitative restrictions on trade. You have to open up the economy, and then you have to convert QRs to tariffs and then reduce the tariffs. So 2 stages: convert quantitative restrictions or QRs to tariffs and reduce it. In other words, go towards free trade. Now, free trade is precisely what we had, compulsory free trade, in the colonial period also. Because free trade means a country giving up its sovereign right to protect its own population from sudden surges in global prices, sudden ups and downs in global prices, its sovereign right to ensure its own food security also. Okay? But that is what they wanted. They want a replication of precisely the economic conditions which had prevailed in the colonial period. Of course, all kinds of arguments were put forward that this would be a far more efficient way of organizing global trade than countries protecting each other, because that will lead to a reduction in the total volume of global trade, etc., etc. Now, mind you, the countries which were telling us to open up to free trade were precisely the countries which had themselves practiced protectionism, and not for 1 or 2 decades, for a century, more than a century. Now, I'll go back a little bit to economic history, because you probably don't know that Britain protected itself against the import of Indian textiles for nearly 150 years. starting in the year 1700. The East India Company used to import Indian textiles, all right, which had a very a strong market, which developed a strong market within England. Okay, England could not produce cotton textiles. It produced woolen textiles, it produced linen, but not cotton textiles until the last quarter of the 18th century. So the woolen industry in England got, which was a very powerful industry, petitioned Parliament saying that these imported textiles from Asia are undermining our market for wool. Because those days, even apart from very rich people, ordinary people had to wear woolens even in summer, which at most they could wear a type of textile called fustian, which was a mixture of imported cotton and linen, which was very coarse. Only the laboring poor used that. So there was a very big demand for fine cotton fabrics which developed within England as well as the continental countries. Now, under pressure from the woolen industry, British Parliament passed an act in the year 1700 saying that all consumption of imported cotton textiles, calicos, or painted and printed textiles from India and Persia were completely banned from the year 1700 onwards. And in 1721, since some amount of smuggling continued, they modified the act to say anyone who is found to be wearing this smuggled textiles would be subject to a fine, individuals to a fine of £5 and merchants to a fine of £21. The per capita annual income in Britain at that time was something like £7. Okay, so it was a very, very heavy fine. Now, this protection continued right up to 1784 for more than 3/4 of a century. It took the British 3/4 of a century to develop spinning machines which could produce yarn which was fine enough to compete with the yarn which was produced by the Indian spinners using the handheld, using the charkha or using the handheld spindle. Because the skill of the Indian spinners was such, they could spin a yarn which was very fine and very strong, but it could not be imitated by the artisans in England. So they had to substitute it by mechanical spinning. The first spindle was developed, mechanical spinning was developed in 1735. It was not commercially viable. Eventually, it was only when you got to the 1770s that they could actually spin yarn which was fine enough. It took them 3/4 of a century to arrive at that. But the protection did not go. The ban on the consumption of Indian and Persian textiles went, but it was replaced by very high tariffs. And even when the first phase of industrial revolution in Britain was over, these tariffs were raised between 1784 and 1813. Tariffs were raised in some categories of Indian textiles from around 1/3 to 74%. So a very high level of tariff protection continued even after the first round of the Industrial Revolution was over. And the last tariff did not go until 1846, when you had generalized free trade. So almost 150 years of protection before the machine sector could actually develop in Britain. And this was the country which kept India completely trade liberalized and which in the neoliberal period was arguing along with the US and other countries that your best interest lies in free trade, after having developed themselves industrially on the basis of protection. Same thing in the United States. I told you that Adam Smith had advised the colonizers in the United States, continue to import your manufactures from us, including textiles. Do not make the mistake, your advantage lies in agricultural production. So don't make the mistake of developing manufacturing. Of course, the United States colonists did not listen. After their independence from Britain, they protected themselves by putting up tariffs against manufacturers' imports from Britain into US in order to build up their own industry. Now, the amusing thing is that their own economists in the neoliberal era are writing books denying that America ever had a period of protection. That is, they're denying historical facts, because now they want to push the idea of free trade globally. but their own countries, in fact, industrialized behind protective barriers. But their interests lie in opening up the global south to the unrestricted demand of the global north. So coming back to the inverse relation, things got worse over the next 7 years from after 2001. From 165 kilograms per capita, in the next 2 years it fell to 161 kilograms per capita. And it continued at that level right up to 2007, 2008. I seem to be the only person who was expressing alarm on this decline in per capita grain availability. Nobody else was talking about it. And they were putting forward this completely. Now, why did it remain at such a low level? Had the Punjab farmers, wheat farmers and rice farmers suddenly become very inefficient? Not at all. It remained at that level because the wrong argument which had been put forward by the government officials and supported by renowned economists, misguidedly supported by renowned economists who visited India once a year but lived abroad all their lives practically, that MSP was too high, led the government to freeze MSP. So between 2003 and 2002 and 2003, 2002 and 2007, MSP was virtually stagnant, even though cost of production was rising. So what are the farmers to do when their cost of production is rising, but the price at which they can sell is kept constant? Farming became more and more unremunerative, unprofitable for them. And that is when you have not only cotton farmers committing suicide, you also have grain farmers committing suicide. Because they get into debt, they're unable to repay the debt. Of course, in Punjab, you had both, because Punjab had also gone in for cotton farming in a big way. And there was one village in Punjab, I remember, which came into the media because there were 59 widows in that single village. 59 farmers in that single village had committed suicide because they were unable to repay the debts they had incurred because the prices simply did not rise when the costs of production were rising. Grain output, wheat output in Punjab over these 6 years became stagnant at 26 million ton. And the per capita grain availability, therefore, because Punjab, UP, Haryana are the grain basket of India. That is where you have the highest production of wheat and the second highest production of rice. The per capita grain output as well as availability declined. So on the one hand, output was falling. On the other hand, the amount that was absorbed by the population was falling even faster because their incomes was being compressed. There was what I call mass deflation of demand. I don't call it mass income deflation because demand has an additional dimension from income. Your income may remain the same, but supposing you are excluded from the public distribution system. The government it is no longer a universal public distribution system. The government tells you, you do not belong to BPL category. You're not below our poverty line. You're actually poor. The government has not given you a BPL card because it has decided you don't belong to that category. Then you get excluded from access to affordable food grains, subsidized food grains from the PDS, even though you are poor. Now this loss of access is in addition to the loss of income and employment. So I call it therefore not just income contraction, but demand contraction, mass demand contraction. And I kept writing again and again about it, but nobody seemed to take any notice. And then the final straw is when very well-known economists who had been working on poverty said that, well, we don't really have to worry about declining food grains demand in India because people are diversifying their consumption. They're diversifying consumption towards superior foods. So when income per capita rises, by the way, income per capita was rising throughout this period because GDP growth was quite strong. But GDP growth tells you nothing at all about the distribution of the growth. You can have a reasonably high GDP growth rate, which leaves out 80% of the population, but the incomes of the top 1%, 2%, 5% is shooting through the roof. The income of the next 10, 15% is increasing, and the income of the bottom 75 to 80% is actually declining. You can have this scenario. It is telling you nothing at all about what is happening to distribution. And that is precisely what was happening. The nature of the neoliberal policies was such that it favored the already well-to-do. It favored those who had property, those who had money, access to money in the banking system, and even the well-to-do were given access to cheap credit because they invaded the priority sector for bank lending. As I mentioned last time, the very definition of the priority sector was changed away from covering only agriculture and small-scale enterprises to include a whole lot of large-scale enterprises also, who elbowed out the poorer seekers of credit from the priority sector. So in such a case, you get an explosion of income inequality, but you get more than that. You get more than an increase in income inequality. Inequality is something that people are talking about a lot nowadays. And Piketty and Chancel from Paris have been making estimates of the extent to which income inequality has increased in various countries, including in India. But I am talking about something much stronger. I'm making a much stronger statement than income inequality alone. Because inequality can go up in a situation where the top 10, 15% is raising its income fast, but the bottom 60, 70% is raising its income also at a very slow rate. You can have increasing income inequality. But I am making a much stronger statement. I am saying that there was absolute immiserization in this period. That is, absolute poverty was increasing. The bottom 50% or so of the population which was poor became poorer, and the next 20% of or so who were non-poor earlier moved into poverty. So there was an absolute downward shift in the position of leaving you with about 3/4 of the population in poverty ultimately by the time you get to around 2007, 2008. So that's a much, much stronger proposition. And I will tell you how I arrive at my figures and why the official figures of poverty are based on a fallacy again, which is why I started my lecture by discussing a fallacy. The method contains a logical fallacy. Not only the Indian government, the Chinese government, the World Bank method, they all follow the same method, which contains a problem. It contains a very serious problem. So this was happening worldwide. India was not the only country where food grains output was going down. I published a book called The Republic of Hunger, which is a collection of short pieces I had been writing, pointing out that the inverse relation was operative in Africa. If you took sub-Saharan Africa, just in 10 years, 1 decade of following free trade policies and cutting back on government expenditure, in 1 decade, there had been a 20% decline in per capita staple food availability, taking sub-Saharan Africa. I used data from 46 countries in a United Nations report, which had been published in 1992, to arrive at this. So that short paper is there in my book called The Republic of Hunger and Other Essays, but it was published a long time ago. It was published in the early 1990s. Similarly, you look at Mexico, Latin American countries, same inverse relation. The moment they open up more to global trade, the moment they start exporting more, the basic food staple of the Mexican population, which is corn, from which they make tortilla, that is the equivalent of our chapati, that goes down sharply. And however, jawar production goes up, sorghum, but that production is for animal feed. And though that animal feed is fed to animals and the meat is then exported across the border to the United States. So that is again going into export production in Mexico. So I discussed Mexico, the inverse relation in Mexico, the inverse relation in Africa. Apart from the historical inverse relation, not only in India, but we see the same historical inverse relation in Java under the Netherlands, in Korea under Japan. So it's an absolutely universal phenomenon that I drew attention to. Now, since it was happening all over the world, you find that during this first decade of this century, globally there is a fall in per capita grain availability. Globally, you take global grain production divided by global population, there's a decline. Since so many countries are following these policies in the global south, and in the global north, there's not much scope for increasing their grain output. They already have very high yields per unit area. They can only produce one crop, one grain crop in the year, which is why today India produces more cereals every year than all 27 countries of the European Union put together. We have a higher cereal output because our cereal output comes from 2 crops in the year. Their cereal output from only 1 crop in the year. So the output per unit area for wheat may be lower for us. Our wheat yield may be lower than in France or Germany. But we have a second crop. So the total cereal production is much higher. Okay. Anyway, coming back, there was a global food price crisis which erupted by the end of 2007. And prices started going up. Now it was added to one part of it, this global food price crisis was this global decline in per capita production. The other important factor was that the advanced countries, particularly the United States, after the debacle in the second Iraq war, which they had undertaken to ensure an uninterrupted supply of oil, but it didn't quite work out that way for them. They had to withdraw from Iraq. They certainly managed to get a regime change. They actually, got rid of Saddam Hussein. They had supported Saddam Hussein earlier against Iran and then turned against Saddam Hussein later on. They got rid of Saddam Hussein, but they could not ensure an uninterrupted supply of oil because that continued to be disrupted by the resistance fighters within Iraq. So what the US started doing from 2002-03 onwards, after they withdrew from Iraq, and in fact even during that, they started diverting their maize production in particular towards producing ethanol. There was an enormous increase from hardly about 20 million ton of maize going into ethanol production in 2003. Within 5 or 6 years, they were devoting, something like 70, 80, went up further to more than 100 million tons of grain to ethanol production. Now, since the United States is a very large exporter of cereals on the global market, they have to be. They can't produce anything else in large amounts, So they have a huge surplus. So they were traditionally a large exporter. When they suddenly cut back on their exports, and the European countries started doing the same. They started diverting their grain to ethanol production. And since we are intellectually servile, or at least our governments are, we are stupid enough to follow their lead and talk about ethanol production being something we should go in for in India as well. So it's very interesting. From 2 centuries of reliance on fossil fuels, the advanced industrial countries were again going back to the land, to using crops as a source of energy. But what it resulted in is in a huge spike in cereal prices on the global market. It started from 2007, if you look at global prices, then the grain price doubled, trebled in a matter of just, 15, 18 months. Now, before that, for a whole decade, the US and the advanced countries had been pressurizing countries in the global south, as I mentioned last time, that you do not need to procure food grains and stock food grains and distribute food grains. Your food security lies in buying food grains from us, because they had these enormous stocks, surpluses to sell. So you don't need to do all this inefficient business of food stocking. Get rid of it. And they had succeeded in pressurizing more than a dozen countries in doing that. When I went to the Philippines in 1997 for a conference, some 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, the Philippines had been pressurized into giving up their procurement and distribution of rice. And just the previous year, there had been massive floods. A large part of their rice crop had been destroyed, and rice prices had spiked in the Philippines, and the laboring poor were rioting because prices had risen. And they were regretting the fact that they had given up their procurement. And this was way back in the mid-1990s that they had been pressurized. By 2004, another 12 countries had given up their food procurement, mostly in Southeast Asia, except the socialist countries, not Vietnam, and of course China was outside the ambit of their pressures. But China too, the developments were very interesting. If I have time, I'll mention them to you. And they did not leave even the smaller African countries alone. A small country like Botswana, by 2004, Botswana had been pressurized into giving up its procurement and distribution system. So every country in the global south was targeted and pressurized. Give it up, buy from us, buy from us. And they had actually done so. So their populations, particularly the urban population, which had to buy food from the market, had become import dependent for food. They were not import dependent to begin with, they were made import dependent. And then you had this global price spike. So what happened? Food went out of their reach for the laboring poor. And you had food riots taking place in 37 developing countries at that time, in the year 2008. It was a major, major political crisis for them. Now, in a sense, that was a wake-up call for the Indian government, because of the global food price hike. They had gone a long way, towards dismantling our own food procurement and distribution system. There were economists who were saying it was very wrong of Punjab and Haryana to specialize in rice and wheat. Rice is a water guzzler. We should diversify away to export crops. Why are we producing rice? I'm not naming the economists who, as it were pushing the theories of the universities from the global rice north. So, the government itself had allowed large multinational corporations like Cargill to come in and directly procure from the Punjab farmers and Haryana farmers, which would have been unthinkable earlier. Contract farming, of course, had all for non-food crops that the north cannot produce in winter at all. All these perishable crops like tomatoes and gherkins and flowers in Karnataka and various things which we can produce in winter, which they cannot produce in their winter. So contract farming by the large agribusiness corporations had already been introduced by the state, by a number of state governments, including in Punjab. And at the same time, in fact, even earlier, the procurement function of the commodity boards which had been there earlier. You see, along with the Food Corporation of India, I think I did not have time to mention it last time, the government in the 1950s had also set up commodity boards with their headquarters in Bangalore. And these dealt with monitoring the prices and procuring in the case of cash crops like tea, coffee, spices, and so on. That headquarter was actually in Bangalore because most of the commercial crops, not all, we have tea production in North Bengal and Assam also, but most of the cash crops production is actually located in Kerala, Karnataka, and so on, as you know. Now, they had a procurement function also. They also invited farmers, if they wished, to sell to the government, these commodity boards, at an assured minimum support price, which could be higher or lower than the global market price. But farmers were free to sell. And they did sell because farmers, after all, require certainty of prices. Farming is an activity which is very different from any other type of production. Because in any other type of production, if you put in inputs, you know what your output is going to be. You have output certainty. If I put in the right amount of labor, the right amount of raw materials, I know my technology, how much output I'm going to get per unit of raw material at a certain amount of capacity utilization, I know exactly what my output is going to be. The farmer doesn't know. He may put in the optimal amount of irrigation, optimal amount of fertilizer, optimal amount of seed, but he still faces output uncertainty. He cannot be certain of the output because of the weather dependentness of agricultural production. So he faces output uncertainty. So if in addition to that you have price uncertainty, if there is uncertainty of the price at which he can sell on the local market or the global market, then for him life becomes very difficult. Making rational decisions, economic decisions, becomes very difficult. So price stability is very important for the farmer. That is what the grain farmers got through the operation of the Food Corporation of India, procurement and distribution system. That is also what the commodity boards managed to establish in the case of cash crop farmers. But that function of the commodity boards are still there. But the function of procurement was given up under so-called trade liberalization and financial sector liberalization. So your producers of coffee and tea and spices were thrown to the mercy of the global procurers, the large global agribusiness corporations. They were thrown. And for the first time, you had, 2008, 9, 10, later, you had farmers committing suicide for the first time in Malabar. There had never been farmer suicides in Malabar before. That is because they no longer had price support. And the suicides went into hundreds. So it was no longer just cotton farmers in Vidarbha, cotton farmers in Punjab, grain farmers. It was also cash crop farmers. It was also the plantation workers in tea plantations in Bengal and Assam, which were hit by this kind of price uncertainty. Smaller plantations started closing down. Right now, you have plantations being affected, producers being affected. Sometimes it is rubber prices which are crashing, and there is no protection. And sometimes it is other cash crops which are crashing, and there is no protection against this, against income loss for the farmers. Our farmers cannot tolerate that. They do not have such deep pockets that they can tolerate prices falling year after year after year for 3 years, 4 years, and so on. And all this is the result of a deliberate dismantling of the earlier system of protection, very sensible system that they had, that you have introduced agrarian crisis into the Indian economy and into large-scale farmer suicides, which according to the estimates by Nagaraj et al., which you must be familiar with, averaged about 16,000 to 18,000 debt-driven farmer suicides a year, and they had reached, in the 20 years after 1997, which is the first time that farmer suicides were being recorded separately, they have reached roughly about 350,000 by now, at a minimal estimates of debt-driven farmer suicides. We don't hear of debt-driven farmer suicides. They may have existed in the colonial period. We don't have data on it. But for an independent country to have suicides of this magnitude is a disgrace. Now, sometime in 2007, because I had also been writing on not only the alarming decline in food grains production, but let me finish this business of the government drawing back from the brink. It had come almost to the brink of dismantling the public distribution, procurement and distribution system. It faced opposition at that time from the farmers of Punjab and Haryana. They said that, look, we want stability of prices. Doesn't matter if the global price is high. We don't want to go rushing off to export. We just want, an economist would put it this way: our farmers are not maximizers, they're satisficers. They don't want to maximize. They don't want to rush to the global market when global prices are high. They're not interested in exporting. They just want an assured level of prices which will cover their cost of production, give a reasonable return on which they can live. And not a very munificent, not a great standard of living, not at all any standard of living which even one person in this room has. Something lower than that, but something which meets their requirements. All right? So that is why we call them satisficers, not maximizers. So they are the people who opposed the dismantling of the PDS. Because there was a very strong effort at that time of the advanced countries to get the government to privatize the entire food grain sector completely. But the global food price hike suddenly alerted the government that this would be very problematic. We would have riots in India if we actually dismantled our public distribution system. So they pulled back from the brink just in time, I would say. And, for the first time in something like 8 years, the minimum support price was raised to a reasonable level. You look at the MSP data, you'll find almost no rise for 6 years, and then it is raised from 2008 onwards to at least cover the cost of production. Not to give a sufficient income to the farmer, but at least to cover cost of production. So from 2008 onwards, we have been getting some rise every year along with the cost of production in the minimum support price. So I sort of heaved a sigh of relief. I said we had almost given it up, but the government just drew back from the brink at that time. So 161 kilograms, which we had reached, was the level we had, the average level of food grains availability we had between 1933 and 1937, just after the Great Depression, So you can imagine how low it was. It is the level that we had in colonized India. The average level in the whole of India was the same in 2007 and the years preceding it as we had between 1933 and 1937. But then what happens? The government claims that poverty is declining in India. In successive, how is poverty calculated? It is calculated on the basis of National Sample Survey, consumer expenditure, and it is calculated on the basis of a poverty line. The definition of the poverty line was that observed monthly per capita expenditure on all goods and services whose food expenditure part would give a minimum energy intake. The minimum energy intake for working health was officially put at 2,400 kilocalories per day for rural India and 2,100 kilocalories per day in urban India. But actually the government, even in its first poverty estimate for 1973-74, never applied its own calorie intake norm. And the reason was because I've investigated the data on the basis of work which has been done by Rohini Nair for the early years and subsequently looking at every single NSS survey. The reason was that in 1973-74, if you applied 2,400 calorie norm, you would have got a poverty percentage of around 70%, which of course was very high. And that was a politically very sensitive time. 1973 is when you had a phenomenal rise in global food prices again, and the riots also happened in India. There was a price rise resistance movement which was being led by Jayaprakash Narayan and by the left forces. So in all major metros there were demonstrations because of the price rise. The poor were finding that, access to food was becoming very difficult for them. So there was a major price rise resistance movement going on in these early 1970s. And we had just come back from doing a doctorate in Oxford, and Prabhat was teaching there, and I had finished my doctorate. We both came back in 1973. And in fact, our income from the university at that time, and remember, university teachers in a central university are paid much better than elsewhere. Our income was 100 rupees a month in 1973. And take-home pay was around 70 rupees a month. And the price of sugar, 1 kilo of sugar had gone up to 2 rupees 85 paisa. So when we went to the shop, we said, how can we afford to buy sugar? My take-home pay in the whole month is only 70 rupees after deducting taxes. Kerosene was not available. We used to carry a can and go to the fair price shop, fill the can up with kerosene, because gas you had to wait a long time. And when we returned, we would come home with the kerosene, then start cooking and have our meal at 11:30 at night, go to sleep past midnight, and then have to take a lecture the next day in JNU. So we have experienced, even belonging to the middle class, what rapid price rise, uncontrolled price rise could do. So that was a very difficult period, because the global price rise, since we also imported at that time fuel, as we continue to do, and that has a cascading effect. If petrol prices rise, then since the transport costs rise, everything rises in tandem. So the government was facing a difficult time with demonstrations all over the place. So it is understandable that it quietly, as it were, lowered its own calorie norm from 2,400 calories a day. I find that 2,200 calories per day would give the poverty line at which you get a rural poverty of 56.4%, which was the official poverty rate for 1973-74 for rural India. And for urban India, the poverty line was some 56 rupees per month. For rural India, it was, I think, 49.6 or something like that. And the poverty ratios are the opposite. 56% roughly in rural poverty, just able to access 2,200 calories. And urban poverty was less than that. It was, from what I remember, around 50% or so in the base year, 1973. Now, I have been talking about the fact that official poverty estimation is based on a logically incorrect method. The logically incorrect method arose because every 5 years since 1973, the National Sample Survey has been giving us data not only on consumer expenditure, but also on the nutritional intake. The nutritional intake data usually come after a few months after the consumer expenditure data. They come in a separate report. But they relate to the same sample of households, okay, exactly the same sample of household. Now, after 1973-74, for reason known only to itself, the Planning Commission, which made these estimates, no longer applied its own definition of the poverty line. It no longer looked at the nutritional intake data to ask the question, what is the particular monthly expenditure at which the calorie norms can be accessed? It did not do that. It has not done so for 50 years. It has stopped applying its own definition after the initial application. What has it been doing? It has been simply indexing the base year poverty lines. It has been bringing the base year poverty line. The base year poverty line were correct. They correctly reflected the definition of poverty line, that is, what proportion of the population could access this minimum nutrition norm. So the base year poverty line was correct. That is the only time it was correct. After that, they have not applied their own definition. They have simply applied a price index to bring forward the poverty line to later years. A consumer price index for agricultural labor for rural India, and consumer price index for industrial workers for urban India. And they never asked the question, when they were updating the poverty, they never ever asked the question, at the new later poverty line, could the population continue to access the nutrition norm? You follow? They never asked that question. They never looked at the nutritional intake data. Now, economists like myself who were not specialists, right up to the end of the 1990s, we were told that the poverty line is arrived at by applying nutrition norms. So we believed. We believed this. We believed that every later poverty line was also arrived at by applying the nutrition norm and finding out whether that poverty line actually allowed people to access that minimum norm. I believed it. But I started questioning, I started getting very puzzled because there was acute agrarian distress. There was this marked fall in food grain availability. And food grains account for, rather the cereals, which make up more than 90% of food grains at that time. Now it's about 88% or so. Food grains, the cereals accounted for 75%, even as late as 2005, from the data, it accounted for 75% of average daily calorie intake. Average. For poorer sections of the population, it is the basic staples, like rice in Kerala, wheat in Punjab, and so on. Atta rotis in Punjab, cooked rice in Kerala, which account for 75% of the daily required calorie intake. Not daily required, daily average calorie intake, all right? And more than 75% of the average protein intake also came from cereals alone, as late as 2005. Why? Because, there are a lot of other foods which give you energy, but which don't give you any protein at all. Oils and fats. That oils and fats give you energy, but there's no protein in oils and fats. So the nature of the average Indian diet has also been changing. That's another thing. That is the proportion of, energy that people derive from cereals has been going down. The proportion they derive from oils and fats has been going up. It has become a less healthy diet because oils and fats don't give you protein. So there has been quite a sharp decline in the protein intake per capita also, because they used to people get their major protein intake from cereals. Cereals give you not only energy but also proteins. Oils and fats don't give you any protein at all. So not only energy intake but protein intake is declining. When I look at the NSS nutritional intake data over the years, I said, what is happening? How can poverty be declining when poverty figures are arrived at on the basis of a nutrition norm? And it is very clear that the nutritional intake is declining from the NSS nutritional data. Average calorie intake is declining. All the figures are there, summarized in the NSS reports. I don't have to calculate anything. It is already there. Average protein intake is declining. So how could poverty be declining? So then for the first time, around the year 2002 or so, I started looking at how poverty was being estimated. Before that, I had simply taken all my colleagues' estimates as correct, or the government estimates as correct. The estimates were being made by academics also, following the same method as the Planning Commission was following. They did not follow any other method. They also followed the same method. So when I started looking at how they were arriving at it, then I was shocked to find that you cannot possibly arrive at official poverty percentages if you continue to apply the nutrition norms. And they were arriving at lower and lower poverty percentages because they had stopped applying the nutrition norms. And they were simply price indexing 1973-74 basket to bring it forward to later years. They were applying what is called a last pairs index. What is a last pairs index? You would have studied, I suppose, last pairs indices and Pash indices and so on. Last pairs index is one in which the base year quantities are kept unchanged and only the change in prices is taken account of over a given period of time. So it is basically P1 Q0 divided by P0 Q0. Only the price changes, the quantities are the same. So applying a last pairs index means that you are keeping the base year basket, the quantities people were consuming of each kind of good and each kind of services, keeping it unchanged. The base year basket is constant. There is no change in it. You are simply updating the cost of the base year basket to a later year. That is all. Now, there is a serious problem with this, at a practical level, whether people get poorer or they get better off, in fact, depends very crucially on whether the consumption basket remains the same or whether the consumption basket changes. Now, people get worse off, they become poorer if the initial consumption basket gets poorer. That is, if the quantities of food, basic food they can access becomes lower, which is what was happening in India during the reform period. But people get much better off if the basic necessities of life are provided by government, and this includes not only food, it also includes things like healthcare. Healthcare is very important for you to be able to lead a productive life. If you fall ill and you cannot afford the hospital bill, if you need an operation which will cure you, get you back to health, working health, but you can't afford it, then how are you going to get better off if you can't work and you can't earn an income? And healthcare now has become a huge issue because that has been privatized also under neoliberal reforms. So provision of basic healthcare, provision of basic food at affordable prices for the mass of the population. The rich can afford to buy from the market, but those who cannot buy from the market need to have subsidized basic food so that at least some purchasing power for them is freed up. Now, there are some very stupid arguments those days which used to be put forward about the public distribution system. So, why should people get only grain and so on from the PDS? They need protein-rich food like milk and chicken. So we said, look, if people in this country cannot afford even cereals to meet their minimum basic energy needs. So if the PDS gives them affordable basic staples that they can afford, it frees up a bit of they have a hard budget constraint. They're very low incomes. It will free up a part of their budget for them to purchase food, milk, to purchase protein-rich foods, which they cannot afford to do now. First, you have to look at the basic staples and provide that, because that is accounting for 75% of the daily energy intake, more than 75% of the protein intake. If that is made affordable, then that will free up their purchasing power. So it's a very simple common sense argument. Now, you find that after the Second War ended in Europe, most European governments, most of them, went in for public provision of healthcare, completely free healthcare. For example, the Labour government in Britain set up the National Health Scheme, which provides completely free healthcare. Actually, even emergency healthcare in the United States is perfectly free. If you get involved in an accident, your leg breaks and you need to have it operated on and you go to emergency in an American hospital, you don't have to pay anything. The same people who are asking us to privatize our healthcare themselves have not privatized their healthcare. It's very interesting, see. Not only did they have free healthcare, they had a completely free educational system. When I studied for 4 years in London, I did not have to pay a penny in school fees. So it's a free educational system until the university stage, right up to the secondary system of education. That is the system they put in place. Free healthcare, free education. And of course, as far as food is concerned, there was not such a big problem. So only a section of the population was estimated as being poor, and provision was made for reaching food to them. But every person who was employed, I also worked for a time in the UK. After I finished my PhD for 1 year, I was waiting to come back. I worked in a travel agency. So every person who worked not only had welfare benefits, but had to be compulsorily given by the employer food stamps. That is coupons which you could exchange for meals in any private restaurant that you went to. I collected my food stamps and then we would go out and have a Chinese meal in a rather expensive restaurant that otherwise we would not have been able to afford, you see. So I'm also speaking from personal experience, free provision of milk to school children. Every day, half a pint milk bottle would be provided free. And as I told you, I went to school for 4 years in London. So I would be given half a pint of milk. It was very cold. So my teacher, who had been educated in Kalimpong, she was a Eurasian actually, Miss Edward. The other students accused her of being partial to me because she came from India, I also came from India. She would put my half bottle of milk in front of the fire to warm it up. I said, I can't drink ice cold milk, like the other children did. So it is not just the socialist countries, even capitalist countries. They were so sick of the privation and deprivation of the Second War. They put in place a system where all these provision of food, healthcare, medical care was considered to be public goods, not to be privately provided, but a minimal level was to be provided by the state. Now, you get an enormous rise in the standard of living of the population when the entire consumption basket is changed, where you no longer have to buy, healthcare from the market, you no longer have to pay for your education, children's education, and so on. And even a large part of food is very cheap because it is subsidized. And transport. Transport was also subsidized. Very cheap transport. Okay? Utilities of various kinds. So the change in the consumption basket is what accounts for a rise in the standard of living of the population. So don't think that it is the socialist countries. Every socialist country also did that. They shifted all these things which were earlier in the private sphere into the public sphere. The state had the responsibility of meeting these consumption costs. What happened in India? Opposite. You had privatization. As it is, we never had a proper public system in terms of healthcare, in terms of other things. Okay? But whatever little there was was privatized. So therefore, people in poverty, their poverty increased. Now, you see, it is very easy to make correct estimates of poverty. This is a very important topic, so I'll just take 2-3 minutes more. I will just give you a sketch of how the entire poverty estimation process after 1973-74 has been wrong. It has been wrong in India, in China, and by the World Bank. All of these have claimed drastic decline in poverty. China has recently claimed zero poverty. In February this year, the Niti Aayog spokesperson said poverty in India has reduced to 5% of the population. All complete nonsense. The World Bank has been giving every year World Development Report in which gives poverty estimates for every country giving, and you see a sharp fall in Asian countries, not so much the African countries. The reason being that most of the African countries have a base year for poverty estimation, which is quite recent. Unlike India, whose by now the Indian base year is 50 years in the past. The Chinese base year is 40 years in the past. Okay? For 50 years, the same basket has been assumed to hold, same consumption basket. For 40 years in China, the same consumption basket. Now, what I have done, and I have not done it over a small period of time, I first started doing it from 2003 onwards, is to look at every large sample survey of the National Sample Survey and to calculate what the government and the Planning Commission should have been doing and what private poverty estimators, the academy should have been doing but did not do. That is for every single year, for all India and every major state in India. I have looked at the nutritional intake data. I have looked at what particular expenditure satisfied the nutrition norms, 2,200 kilocalories in rural India, 2,100 calories in urban India. Then that particular expenditure has been applied to the ogive, that is the cumulative proportion of persons below given expenditure levels to arrive at the poverty percentage. So that has been taken me months to do. In fact, I have personally constructed more than 600 graphs, personally, because after seeing what my colleagues had been doing, what the Planning Commission had been doing, I do not trust anybody to do the calculation. So it was very tiresome, very, very tiresome, I can tell you. And I didn't do it all at once. The major part of the work was done when I was in Kerala, on leave from my university, quietly doing this work up to 2004-5, because I had to do for 1978, 83, 88, 93, 99, 2000. So for 6 large sample rounds, and not only all India, but 18 major states, rural as well as urban. One chart for the Ujjayi, one chart for the nutritional intake data. So altogether more than 400 charts. So that was the major part of the work, which had to be done all at once, all right? Then every time the NSS data have been coming out, I have been doing the same exercise of applying the actual official nutritional norms to find out the true poverty line at which the nutrition norms are satisfied. And what I found was very interesting. I published a number of papers on this, that right up to the early 1990s, there's not much change in the poverty percentage, even according to the official estimate. That is, starting from 56% rural India in 1973, it goes up at most to 58% or so by the late 80s. In urban India, similarly, this changes by 2 or 3 percentage points, hardly much increase. But the moment you look at the sample surveys after neoliberal reforms started, the whole of the 1990s, right up to 2004-5 data, which became available around 2008, you get a sharp rise in the proportion of the rural population unable to access 2,200 kilocalories by about 20 percentage points. By 2004-5, it had gone up to about 75%. And similarly, the urban population unable to access 2,100 calories had also gone up, again by 18 to 20%, around 72, 73. But the exact proportions I'm not giving you now. I'm just giving you an idea of the broad orders of magnitude. So there's a rise in poverty in the 15 years after neoliberalism started, if we apply the Planning Commission's own definition. Why is the Planning Commission getting sharp decline in poverty? Because at its price indexed poverty lines, lower and lower nutritional intake can be accessed. That is, every successive poverty line it has arrived at by price indexing the base year poverty line is actually giving you lower and lower nutritional intake. That is, the 2004-5 official poverty line is giving you much lower nutritional intake than you got in 1973. At the all India level, about 200 to 50 calories less. The 2004-5 urban poverty line, similarly, the official poverty line is giving you a 300 calorie per capita lower intake at the all India level than the initial level. So what the official measure has been doing is improperly counting the poor below a continuously declining standard. The standard itself has not been held constant. The standard has been permitted to decline because of the wrong procedure of changing the definition of the poverty line after the initial definition, of delinking the definition in practice from the declared definition. Now, you can't do that. That is called a fallacy of equivocation, where the same term, in this case poverty line, is used in two completely different meanings. The initial meaning of the poverty line, it is directly calculated from whether it satisfied nutrition norm. The definition actually followed after 1973's fall is whether the price indexed line, what the price index line is giving you, with no reference anymore to nutrition, not a single reference to whether the nutritional norms are satisfied or not. So the example I give you of a very simple example of this fallacy is, supposing I were to say, Professor Utsa has been delivering her address to this gathering of students and faculty for the past more than 1 hour. What will you understand by that? That she has been giving a lecture to you for the past more than... And the inference I draw from it, therefore every person present in this room knows exactly her postal address where she lives. Now, I've been delivering my address to you for more than 1 hour. So every person sitting in this room knows exactly where I live. Is the inference correct? No, you don't know where I live. You don't know my postal address. But what is happening here? Here, the same term, address, is being used in two completely different senses. In the initial sentence, it is being used as a lecture. In the second sense, it is being used as a place of residence. So your inference is incorrect. Now, logicians will give a similar example to you. They call it the fallacy of equivocation. That is equivocal use of a term. The same term is improperly used in two different senses in the course of an argument. So you understand why I say that studying logic is very important, okay? Because these have all been classified, the kind of mistakes you can make, the verbal fallacies. There are 56 different kinds of verbal fallacies. They've all been classified for 2,000 years, starting with Aristotle. Modern books on logic like Copy, which is a standard textbook for students, will start with Aristotle, then add additional material. So please go back and study an elementary textbook on logic, because none of you can have been taught to think logically. All of you are committing fallacies all the time, of some kind or the other. In fact, even well-trained, famous economists have been committing these fallacies. Okay? Should I stop now? I think already I have been going on for more than 1 hour. But this was a very important thing. The actual, I've also done the calculation. Let me end with one sentence. I've also tried to do the calculations for the 2017-18 survey, National Sample Survey. The full data were not released to the public. For a short while, it was put on a website. The first expenditure data by the NSS, not the full data either. The government quickly removed it because the situation it depicted was so bad. It showed that the real expenditure not only on food had been falling, but the real expenditure per capita on all goods and services had fallen compared to 2011. And that was not a conclusion they liked. So they've removed the data. But it has been leaked and it was made available to me. So I've also tried to make estimates of what the true poverty level would have been in a more recent year, 2017-18. Later I can give you my estimates if we have time.